The IEA has advised that 60% of rural electrification, bringing power to over 480 million people, is best achieved via mini-grids. Unsurprisingly, this has led to a number of decision makers focusing their attention on how to unlock this huge potential. Well, in a recent Power for All survey, technical and quality standards, clear regulation, and the licensing of mini-grid providers are all aspects that mini-grid companies have pinpointed as vital for market growth. And to share insights on these levers for growth, we are fortunate to be joined by Sebastian Rieger, the Finance Director for Rafiki Power, a mini-grid company owned by the utility E.ON, which has built 8 photovoltaic mini-grids in Tanzania and has plans to increase that number by 25-fold. Thank you so much for joining us, Sebastian. Now, Rafiki Power has already built 8 mini-grids and is aiming to increase that number to 100 mini-grids in the next 2 years. What was it that first attracted you to Tanzania, and what are some of the challenges and the opportunities you've experienced since you set up in 2013?
We were attracted by several things, starting from very good economic environment, relatively stable economic growth, politically stable country. For us as a German company, also important for first step into Africa was English as primary language, and then also relatively big market potential, meaning the overall population in Tanzania, but then also the total population of people without electricity access. And last but not least, also a fairly good regulatory environment for private sector in the energy industry, but also for off-grid, mini-grid in particular. Tanzania was one of the first countries to actually have separate legislation on it.
And how important has that been for those plans to rapidly accelerate the rollout that you have? And in terms of that regulatory environment, where do you feel the challenges perhaps still lie?
The challenges from the regulatory side are that there's still a couple of very significant gaps in the regulation. While the regulation does leave you a lot of flexibility and freedom, it also leaves a lot of uncertainty and questions, and basically puts the private sector in a risk position where it's a big of a question mark whether you can really go to scale in such a risky environment. The risks in particular are intransparency about grid extension plans and where will the national grid go within the next 1 to 2 years, but also within the next 3 to 7 years. Then also not clear regulation about what happens when the grid arrives. So what are the commercial mechanisms that would become effective when the national grid arrives at your mini-grid site? And also what are the technical requirements that you need to fulfill to have an acceptable solution when the grid arrives? What technical standards do you fulfill to have your grid becoming integratable with the national grid? And then there are a lot of licensing requirements that are designed for larger scale projects, which are not fit for purpose for small scale grid. And what we also learned in Tanzania is that while it has a huge overall market potential, the potential for individual projects is relatively small. If you would build mini-grid systems in every village in Tanzania, then the average project size would be relatively. We're not talking about hundreds of kilowatts that you would install, but we're talking about 10 to 50 kilowatts. And whether it's 50 kilowatts, 10 kilowatts, depends on what are your demand expectations. And then while you have such small projects, if you then have licensing requirements for environmental permits, for building permits, sectoral licenses, etc., which are basically designed more for larger scale projects, it does not really become handy anymore. Tanzania does have some exemptions for small scale power producers, but still the devil lies in the detail, and there are still a couple of really critical things that make realization on the ground really difficult and time and cost.
Absolutely. Sounds like there's a number of challenges still there, Sebastian. So in terms of that integrated planning between the central grid and mini-grid developers and making it more more comprehensive what will happen when the grid comes, and also perhaps streamlining regulation and licensing in a way that will enable more rapid growth of mini grids. Where do you think that government and mini grid developers can still work together, and what would you like to see come up from the government side of things to help that process?
I think what is important to understand is that, first of all, flexibility to operate and freedom and a competitive environment for private players is definitely welcome, and is necessary to have competition and to have different technical solutions and ultimately really bring the most economic solution to reality. However, what is quite important for mini grids is that this is long-lasting infrastructure that is being built. It's not a system which has a payback period of 5 years. If we build mini grids according to technical standards that basically also allow for productive use, which means three-phase power, AC power, and also for upgrading capacity over time along with demand, and potentially also integrating it into the national grid at some point, this infrastructure comes with quite some cost, and it's actually built for, if you only look at the distribution part, easily 20 to 30 years. The payback periods are in the range of 10 years time if you have reasonable tariffs. But I think what we have in Tanzania is a bit basically like in the wild, wild west. The regulation leaves you a lot of freedom, and you can just go out and build projects. But if you would look at it from a real financial investor perspective, you would actually never build these projects because the risk that it will really make your payback are so high that either the return requirements would increase drastically, and therefore then your tariffs that you would be charging, or you basically not build these projects. But I think we have a really great environment for pilots, but for really meaningful scale, there's not the right environment. So to actually answer your question, what is needed, in my view, to have such an environment, I think governments should really have off-grid systems as a more integrated part of their planning, and they should see mini grids. With mini grids, I'm always referring to mini grids that have a certain minimum technical standard, so not a low-tech, really small-scale microgrid, but always a reasonable technical standard. And they should see these mini grids as a part to actually a chance to accelerate grid extension and to accelerate electricity access. Because it's not a question about giving people secondary energy access with a mini grid. First of all, the mini grid can give them the same, if not also in some instances better, energy access service level than the national grid can. And second, it can easily be integrated once the national grid arrives. However, it can be ready today or tomorrow and not just in 3 or 5 years. And what national governments should really do is take mini grids really into their planning and try to come up with a competitive environment for private sectors, but integrated in their central planning system. For example, national governments should go out and say, we want to electrify this region. We have our plans to build transmission lines, and it will take this and this many years. And if you can build mini grids for a certain tariff, then you should get a concession. And then you should get some relative clear understanding by when the national grid arrives, and then you can take that into account when calculating your payback period. So they should really sit together more with the private sector in planning of the national electricity.
In terms of other countries, we're talking a lot about Tanzania, which is where your mini grids are based. But are you seeing the policy and regulatory environments changing in a way that will hopefully begin to bring this kind of scale into mini grid development? And if you did have a crystal ball, what would be your prediction for the expansion of the mini grid sector over the next few years?
So I think we see a lot of things gradually happening in a couple of countries. So Nigeria is working on its mini grid regulation. In Uganda, There are plans to have some sort of tenders coming up for isolated mini grids in some areas. Kenya already has sort of tender scheme for mini grids already executed, and similar activity is happening in Madagascar. We are following this with I would say half an eye, so we have some rough understanding, but I do not have a real detailed understanding about planned timelines on working the regulation in Nigeria. But my general feeling is that a lot of countries see, at least to some extent, the possibility of accelerating energy access by having a more private sector friendly regulation in the energy sector. Whether the regulation fully goes into the right direction or whether there will be a lot of shortcomings left, I cannot really tell right now. Regarding a more general outlook for mini grid future, I do see it a bit mixed. On the one side, as just mentioned with a couple of examples, I do see quite a lot of positive developments. Also in Tanzania, the regulatory issues have to some extent been identified by policymakers. They are being worked on to some extent. How fast and how positive the changes will come is yet to see, but in general it goes into the right direction. And I think there is a chance that policymakers and national governments really can see mini grid as a chance to accelerate energy access in their country, and therefore also see them as a solution at the same quality as other energy solutions in their country. And I still strongly believe that there is macroeconomic sense for mini grid. Mini grids can provide electricity at lower or very close to the same cost as you would have it with the extent national grid. So these are the reasons why I'm still positive for a, let's say, Africa-wide positive development of mini grids. On the other side, I also, from the last 2 years in Tanzania, had a bit of a reality check in the sense that the amount of time that policymakers and decision makers, etc., can focus on certain topics is fairly limited. And there is a natural benefit for having big projects like grid extension or big power plants, simply because it's easier to fund 100 million of grid extension than to fund 100 times 1 million for a mini grid project, for example. And also there's just a political reality that politicians can crowd themselves with like bigger projects and put their name on them, which is not so easy than if they have to do it for really small scale projects. So I think there's a big reality, gives a big political advantage to the conventional energy system, also from a donor and financing point of view. So also for the likes of World Bank and KfW, etc., it's still much easier to push money into grid extension than it is to finance the quite opaque mini grid sector where a lot of private players are in there. In that respect, I currently see there's a bit of a make or break coming up for the mini grid sector for the next few years, I would say. Right now, you attracted a lot of different companies, and also the first utilities are going into the sector. So first you had a lot of, let's say, small-scale startup companies in that sector, and now with us, E.ON, but also Engie and EEP, they all look into the mini grid sector. And there is a sort of momentum, but if within the next 2 to 3 years the sector cannot come to a commercial scale, then I think policymakers will all say, well, mini grid sector doesn't really come to speed, so we focus on grid extension again. So I see this year and maybe the next 1 or 2 years as quite critical for the sector.
Absolutely. We'll keep our fingers firmly crossed that things keep moving in the right direction, and some of the complexities of the political frameworks that you described can be overcome, because obviously that could have such a huge beneficial impact at the end. Well, a huge thank you, Sebastian, for taking some time with us this morning. and fabulous to get your insights. Thank you very much.
Thank you.